Welcome back. This is part 3 of the Chapter 54 lecture on community ecology. We left off talking about succession, and we're going to look at how the steps of succession can be linked. So early arriving species often are going to make the early arriving species are often going to change the ecosystem. And then later arriving species will thrive based off of those changes. So maybe an early arriving species can fix nitrogen, and once the nitrogen builds up, larger plants that need a lot of nitrogen can then start to establish themselves. So sometimes you're looking at how fast does the organism grow. Sometimes you're looking at the food web. Sometimes you're just looking at the available nutrients and nutrition for the organism to grow. So I guess that's sort of related to the food web, but can be expanded to include things like nitrogen and other nutrients. So you can see that the relationship between the early arriving and later arriving species could be that early arrivals facilitate the appearance of later species. So that's kind of the example I just talked through. You may see where early arrivers inhibit the establishment of later species. Maybe they release some sort of an acid or a heavy metal that prohibits larger plants from growing. And then sometimes it has nothing at all. They're not really connected to one another. So there are a couple of really good places to study succession. Retreating glaciers is a great place to study succession because we're typically, when a glacier melts, we're seeing soil that has no built up, dirt, I guess, that has no soil built up, no nutrient content. Sandy areas are another great place to study succession. So things like dunes and things along those lines. So we'll look at Glacier Bay in Alaska. The succession follows a very prescribed pattern, and it's the same pattern that we see in all cases of succession, but we can put some specific organism names to the pattern. So let's just kind of dive into it. You see here where the glacier at Glacier Bay has been over time. You see in 1760 it reached all the way down here. The glacier has retreated this way over the last 200 years or so. So as that glacier retreats, we're going to see new areas exposed to the air, and that is new opportunity for plants to settle. In the pioneer stage, we see these basic producers taking over and being really just taking hold, living, dying, and cycling their nutrients back into the soil. Stage 2, we see larger plants. We see more plants filled in. You see some bushes and shrubs popping up in there in between the dryas. The alders are really thin, fast-growing trees that don't need a whole lot of nitrogen, and they actually fix nitrogen that allows spruces to grow. And once we get to the spruce stage, that's kind of our climax community. That's our healed ecosystem. So you can see that basically this part that was exposed latest it exhibits pioneer stage. So if you walk from here all the way to there, you're going to walk all the way through the process of succession. You're going to start at the area that was most recently uncovered, and then move to stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. So this today, we would start further back because the glacier has receded even further. So that's a really good way to look at succession in real time. You don't need to wait 100 years for the time to pass. You can walk and study each different stage based on where it is in relationship to the other. This picture shows that there's a cluster of nodules that have a symbiotic relationship. It's a bacteria that live with those alder trees. They really help build up that nitrogen. So that's a great example of the earlier arriving organism laying the groundwork for the later arriving organism. You see, throughout the different stages of succession, we have a little nitrogen. As these organisms live and die and photosynthesize, they're going to put a little bit into the soil. Then the dryas are going to put a little bit more. Then the alders are going to get that symbiotic relationship, and we're going to see a ton of available nitrogen that's going to power those spruce trees. So then if we specifically look at secondary succession, we're looking at places where there has been a thriving ecosystem. Something has disturbed that ecosystem, that climax community, and then what happens? Well, secondary succession takes over. It's going to follow the same pattern as primary succession, but it's going to happen a lot faster. We've got a head start. We've got that soil already. There's already nutrients. A lot of times, if it's something like a fire, we're going to have a lot of the nutrients deposited directly onto the soil. So that soil is going to be really nutrient rich. You see on the screen there, it talks about abandoned ag land. If you just leave a field fallow where you're not planting crops, over time that will build up nutrients and it'll go back to a forest eventually.